We're good. Okay. Well, thank you for that. So then, Jill, you're going to have to mute yourself, please. So then the Lake Erie Commission, and it's on all these presents, I think I see Joy Molinex sometimes more than my kids at some of these meetings. So Joy Molinex is here, and so is Sandra Kosick Sills. And so we always know that they are always deep in the middle of everything that is Lake Erie. So thank you for the work from the Lake Erie Commission. I do want to say that there's, since 2015, since the first harmful algal bloom that really rocked this area with the drinking water advisory in Toledo in 2014, we've had funding from the Ohio Department of Higher Education, so under Chancellor Gardner, to fund research efforts to support our state agencies. So we're doing a lot of research to make sure that the work that the agencies are doing has a lot of science to back up those decisions. And so I want to thank the Chancellor of the Ohio Department of Higher Education. And also that program is co-managed and co-run by Ohio Sea Grant, but also the University of Toledo. So Tom Bridgman is also here with us today. So the University of Toledo and Ohio Sea Grant co-manage that harmful algal bloom research initiative. Again, NOAA's here, but I can't go without mentioning also HABARCA. If you're not familiar with that acronym, that's the Harmful Algal Bloom and Hypoxia Research Control Lab. So that's quite a mouthful, but it is a great effort under NOAA, and there are granting research funding that happens underneath there. Some of that work is for monitoring and response to HABs. Some of it is to learn about the ecology of HABs. Some of that is really for the prevention, control, and mitigation of HABs. So just wanted to make sure we don't forget about NOAA's role in HABARCA. We also have the great pleasure of having the NOAA Clairol office, the NOAA Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab, right in our backyard here in Ann Arbor. And so we have representatives. Jen Day is here with us today. And I thought Craig Stowe was here. I haven't seen him walk in today. Didn't come this morning. But we have great representation from the NOAA Clairol office. Also not able to make it today to the event, but we do have a tremendous USDA presence in the watershed also, with the work to do edge of field monitoring and to fund pilot watersheds to begin study best practices and practices on the landscape to reduce our nutrient runoff from our producers who are willing and wanting to be part of the solution. It's just not an easy solution set sometimes to get out there in the field. We do have representation from the USGS. Dave Straub's here, over here. So Dave, just wanted to mention USGS is absolutely critical, as you'll learn when Laura Johnson comes up from Heidelberg. We need USGS in many ways, but most specifically in the gauge stations that the USGS helps us monitor, so we know where the nutrient levels are at and where they're going. There are tri-commissions in the Great Lakes. For those of you that are familiar with this area, one of those is represented here today. So we have the Great Lakes Commission here. So Nicole Zaccarda is in the back room. When I think of Nicole and when I think of the Great Lakes Commission, I think of many things, but in this space, Blue Accounting, and also when we think of the HABs Collaborative. And so there are great initiatives that fall under the Great Lakes Commission that have many, many partners that are in this room, and those are critical programs moving forward too. I had the pleasure of sitting on the IJC, so the International Joint Commissions. So I will humbly represent the IJC today, but the work happening under their Science Advisory Board and under the Water Quality Board, again, are in this HABs and nutrients space. And then last but surely not least is the Army Corps of Engineers. So we know that we've had a lot of support and funding from the federal government coming through the Army Corps of Engineers to do the same things, to do event response, to do mitigation, to do monitoring, and to do foundational research. How do we keep our drinking water free of toxins? And so that was a lot. That was 6 minutes, and I did not do that entire justice. But I want to show that we have the right players in this state and in Michigan, Indiana, be doing what we need to do to get. I'm just really proud to have all these folks in the room. We actually have folks from Michigan. So is Chad? Chad's coming to us. So he's the deputy director for MDART. So we have Michigan folks in the room that are talking about what they can do in the ag and rural development space. And then also, can't go without saying, it's not only federal investment and state investment that goes to here. I want to welcome John Erb to the room too. And if folks aren't familiar, John is here as chairman of the Erb Family Foundation. And so there's a lot of support that comes through our foundations in the region to help us out. So we're going to next move into some opening remarks. We have 5 videos that we're going to show you today for our some elected officials that wanted to be here but sent videos. And then after that, I'll introduce some of the other aides that are in the room representing other legislative districts. I do, as we get those videos loaded up here, I want to point out, we also have some amazing content experts in the room. So I introduced Tom Bridgman already, one of our HAB experts from the University of Toledo. We have Sylvia Newell, formerly of Wright State, now director of Michigan Sea Grant. So coming down to us from Michigan. Justin Chaffin is our own research coordinator here from Ohio State University in Stone Lab. And then you'll hear some of the speakers coming up throughout the day. Jay Martin and John Witter are also some of our content experts. What we're hoping is after you hear the forecast and after you hear the talk from John on two-stage ditches and Jay on legacy or old phosphorus, that we have the audience in here to field questions. And so we're going to try and make as much time as we can available for those questions. And I wanted to thank the media also for being in the room, because it's hard for us to get this information out if we don't have that outlet. So we're going to see how this works. As you can see, we're going to start with Senator Brown first. See how this works.
I'm Sherrod Brown. It's an honor to represent Ohio in the U.S. Senate. Thanks to Chris Winslow, everyone at the Ohio Sea Grant and Stone Lab for hosting this important event every year and for your research that furthers our knowledge of Lake Erie. Thank you to NOAA and Heidelberg for all your work to make these forecasts possible. Lake Erie is the most vital economic, environmental, and cultural treasure our state has. Billions of dollars in commerce, thousands of species, hundreds of communities rely on the lake. It really is part of who we are as Ohioans. That's why I fought to secure historic funding for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative in the bipartisan infrastructure law. We're creating good-paying Ohio jobs, making historic progress, restoring the shallowest and the most vulnerable Great Lake, Lake Erie, improving our water infrastructure, supporting communities whose economies depend on the lake. Ohio has shown for years that we don't have to choose between saving our environment and growing our economy. We do both. We can do both right here in Northwest Ohio and all along the lake shoreline from Northwest Ohio all the way to Ashtabula. Thank you and enjoy the annual forecast.
Back on again. So thank you for those words from Sherrod Brown. We paused here because we thought we'd have John Ryan, a representative from Congressman Brown's office. He called me this morning and he's ill. He says his first day he's taken off in many, many years. So didn't know why the timing had to be such, but it is. But they were intended to have a representative aide here, but we thank Sherrod Brown for the video. We'll go on to the next video for us today. So Congressman Latta.
Good morning. I'm Bob Latta, and thanks very much for being at the conference today. I'm sorry that I'm not able to join you. We have votes in Washington, but it's essential that you are here. The harmful algal blooms that we have on Lake Erie affect us all. From our drinking water to our recreation use of the lake, it's absolutely essential. We all know that Lake Erie is our crown jewel. And so I want to thank NOAA, Ohio State Sea Grant, Stone Lab for all the work that they do. I know through all my years in Congress and also prior to that in the Ohio legislature, my work with them has been very, very beneficial. Especially in 2014 when we had the big bloom on Lake Erie, when we saw 500,000 people around the city of Toledo not having water. My first calls, of course, were to Stone Lab and Ohio State Sea Grant, and really helping me craft legislation with other federal agencies, state of Ohio, and local departments, coming up with our Drinking Water Protection Act. So I just again want to thank you for being there today, and I wish I could be with you, but thanks very much.
Great, we'll pause there. We actually do have David Wirt in the room today, so an aide from Congressman Latta's office. David, any comments or thoughts, sir? Thank you, David. That's great. We'll go into our third recording. This is Congressman Wahlberg, and actually coming from representative from Michigan.
Midwesterners, we all understand firsthand the importance the Great Lakes play in our livelihood and way of life. The Great Lakes are our region's most precious and indispensable resource, acting as a vital economic and environmental asset for the region and our nation at large. As the largest system of fresh surface water in the world, the Great Lakes provide safe drinking water to more than 40 million people, while also serving as a destination for families to enjoy an extensive range of recreational activities, from fishing to boating to swimming. The lakes also support the region's critical $12.9 billion tourism industry and provide for the essential transportation of goods throughout the region. The strength of our region's economy is directly tied to the long-term health of the Great Lakes, and as stewards of the Great Lakes, we bear the responsibility of preserving their well-being for future generations. However, the Great Lakes have faced challenges over the years, including the proliferation of algal blooms. Lake Erie in particular has been experiencing increasingly severe algal blooms, threatening drinking water for those in the region, posing risks to human and animal health, endangering ecosystems, and creating significant economic ramifications. Forecasting these harmful algal blooms is critical to mitigating the effects of these blooms, keeping drinking water and recreation in Lake Erie safe, and developing phosphorus reduction strategies. I continue to be encouraged by the positive impacts of efforts such as those by NOAA in developing these models, and am proud to join my colleagues in bipartisan efforts to safeguard the long-term health and well-being of our national treasure, the Great Lakes. We all must do our part to preserve these waters so that the Great Lakes continue to be enjoyed by generations to come.
Congressman Walberg does not have a representative that can make it today, but I would like to go to the next video, which is Representative Dingell.
Hi, everyone. This is Congresswoman Debbie Dingell from Michigan's 6th District on the other side of the lake. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person today, but I am always grateful to have the opportunity to share a few words about the importance of protecting and investing in our most precious natural resources. For thousands of years and across generations of Americans, no other freshwater system in the world has inspired greater economic prosperity, quality of life, or binational unity than the waters of our Great Lakes. And we have an urgent responsibility to keep these waters safe for generations to come. Harmful algae blooms threaten public health and pose a risk to our drinking water and our wildlife, and have and can cause serious ecosystem disruption. It is critical that we continue to invest in the research and the science to understand and address the root causes of HABs and how they are being accelerated by climate change. To continue to monitor and forecast of HABs like we are doing today, and to strengthen our response capabilities. And what I hope and want, and I think we all do, is to eventually eliminate them. I thank NOAA for their diligent work protecting our residents and environment from the threat of HABs, and will continue to ensure that this is a priority in Congress. Thank you.
And last, we have a video from Representative Chantel Brown.
Hello, everyone. I'm Congresswoman Chantel Brown, representing Ohio's 11th Congressional District, which includes the Lake Erie shoreline from Euclid to the Port of Cleveland to Lakewood. I want to thank everyone at Ohio State Stone Lab and NOAA for putting together this briefing and for your continued work to promote a cleaner, safer, and healthier Lake Erie. The HAB Forecast is an important tool for our coastal communities and for all of us who use the lake for recreation, commerce, or drinking water. My office looks forward to receiving this information and sharing it with our constituents. As a member of the Great Lakes Task Force, I look forward to continuing to work with my colleagues to make Lake Erie healthier and to support economic and cultural development in the region. Thank you for the work that you do. Here's looking forward to an enjoyable summer on the lake.
Great. I just want to recognize a couple other folks that are in the room representing offices. So we do have a representative from Senator Vance's office. So Tim Schneider. Tim, any words you want to say?
Thanks. Just real quickly, let's move up here. Senator Vance apologizes he can't be here himself, but I'm glad to be here on his behalf. So thank you. I'll share that Senator Vance is co-chairing the U.S. Senate Great Lakes Task Force and has expressed a number of priorities around protecting the Great Lakes and improving water quality, one of which is fully funding the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. So I wanted to share that with you, along with a number of other priorities. Also, thank you to everyone in the room that's involved in these issues, the agencies, the nonprofits, the universities, all of the stakeholders. Thank you for all that you do on this issue. So thank you.
And then from Congressman Kaptur's office, David Zavick.
I want to echo what everybody said about thanking everyone for the great work that they do. This event is always really informative every single year. Representative Kaptur always likes to point out that in her years of service, Put-in-Bay is one of the only places that has been in the district, any map that they've drawn. So she loves it, special place in her heart for it. But I would just simply say we have so many stakeholders in the room, and that's rare. If our office can be helpful applying for GLRI dollars or even H2 Ohio dollars, connecting dots, letters of support, introductions, we want to be as helpful as possible. Even if the grant doesn't ask for a letter of support, we still want to do one. So please reach out to us. We want to be. Thank you.
David, if you want to pass the microphone to Lydia Dennis, representing Congressman Dave Joyce.
It's nice to see you, and it's nice to finally make a trip out to Stone Lab. I was previously with Senator Portman working on Great Lakes issues in his DC office, so I know I've bothered quite a few of you over the years with a lot of questions and comments, and you guys have all been very helpful in explaining things to me. So I've moved over to Congressman Joyce's office this year, continuing to work on Great Lakes issues, including reauthorizing the HABs program this year. So I know I'll be bothering many of you more in the months and years ahead. So thank you all. It's great to be with you.
Ray. So Ray from Congressman Max Miller's office.
Thank you. Just to echo everyone else's thoughts, happy to be here. Appreciate the work that everybody in this room does to support Lake Erie, the Great Lakes, and water quality here in the state. And again, anything that our office can do to be helpful, whether it's on the grant side or legislative side, we want to be a partner and an asset as well. So happy to be here.
All right, we're going to get on to one more introduction. We're all talking about the great work that NOAA is doing in this space, and that's absolutely true. And we're lucky to have Dr. Sarah Kipnick. She's the chief scientist for NOAA. And so her role is really to advance policy and program direction around NOAA's science priorities and their technology priorities. So we're happy to have her. In Sarah's background, Dr. Kipnick's background, you'll see that she has a tremendous interest in that climate science and economics interaction. So I'm going to turn the program over to Dr. Kipnick.
Thank you so much, Chris. I am so excited to be here. I am Sarah Kipnick. I am the chief scientist of NOAA. I believe in transitioning science into actionable products for use by multiple sectors. As a climate scientist and also as a financial expert, I see the potential and the value of climate products and services for multiple sectors, including economic industries. This also includes exposing the public and corporates to our passion for the Great Lakes, as well as educating them on the existing resources that can inform all of their decision-making. Being here is also really personal for me because I grew up in the Great Lakes in Illinois and in Michigan. My family is from Ohio originally as well. And coming out here, seeing the lakes, the importance of the information that we're putting out is critical for making sure that we manage this resource, that we plan for it, and that we really support commerce in the region throughout the entire season so we can make best use of our Great Lakes. So today, the Lake Erie harmful algal bloom seasonal forecast is produced by NOAA and is released with our Ohio Sea Grant based at the Ohio State University. NOAA's HABs Forecast Bulletin for Lake Erie was first issued in 2008, while the first seasonal forecast was issued in 2012, and the severity index was also created and used for the first time in 2014. The forecast transitioned to operations only in 2017. We're really good at predicting low versus high bloom, which is great for advanced warning. The forecasts have accurately provided early warning of major blooms like those in 2015, 2017, and 2019, and forecasted smaller blooms in years like 2012 and 2020. On the car ride up here, I actually was even talking to my taxi driver who was telling me about how much he remembers how clear the lake was in 2020 and how he remembers this bloom. It is, everyone is talking about it, everyone is excited about it and knows the importance of this forecast information that we are producing. We evaluate the performance of these forecasts every single year and regularly reevaluate models, which allows us to identify areas of improvement. The forecast, based largely on phosphorus discharge from the Maumee River and our associated analysis of blooms from satellites, allows coastal managers, lake users, and drinking water facility operators to make informed decisions based on the potential severity of the bloom. Supporting the states and the communities around Lake Erie is really critical from this information as well to plan the strategies to reduce the blooms and their impacts. The use of satellites to detect and monitor blooms in Lake Erie is helping us also understand blooms in other Great Lakes. So the information that we're taking here, we are translating it across all of the region and across the rest of the country. NOAA now routinely monitors lakes and estuaries for these blooms in support of several coastal states. And the interagency Cyan project extended the methods to monitor another 2,000 large lakes across the entire country. The science, the information, the knowledge that has been built here is supporting everyone across the nation. Weekly bulletins are issued throughout the bloom season. Here for Lake Erie HAB Alert Listserv, which includes now over 7,800 US and Canadian email subscribers. Later in the program, you will hear the forecast and severity index for 2023. In the meantime, additional improvements to the forecasts are ongoing that will include biological parameters such as cyan bacteria, growth rates, and toxic levels to provide a better forecast of the bloom dynamics. We continually assess our forecast performance and use this information to make our predictions even better for the future. As a climate scientist, I understand the importance of seasonal forecasts for decision making. I led some of our research in the space for many, many years. This product is another way to support our long-term efforts in creating also one of the long-term goals of NOAA in building a climate-ready nation. Having this type of information is really critical to be able to deal with the challenges that we have of extreme events in our communities, and being able to have this information in advance allows us to build up operational plans for when we have a severe HAB. How do we then put that, spring it into action when one is forecasted to be able to handle it? This type of science, this information, these seasonal forecasts are really critical for reducing the impacts of these types of events. Thank you all for being here supporting this effort. And with that, it is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Laura Johnson, Director of the National Center for Water Quality Research, Heidelberg University. Please take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Kibbe. I told Laura she's got to be around 10 minutes. She's telling me she's at 12 minutes. So let's all
Hold on tight, guys. Here we go. Yes, I took that picture of the Maumee River. Isn't that exciting? It can be a lovely place to hang out. So I'm going to tell you about what we've seen over the past few months. And I guess I need this clicker. Is this my clicker? Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay, so as a quick reminder, we monitor the Maumee River in Waterville, Ohio. The lovely map I got from Model My Watershed. So if you want to play around with watershed mapping, go on there. You can see we're not all the way at the very end of the watershed. As a reminder, we have to be away from the lake so we don't have lake influence in our water samples. And we're co-located at a USGS gauge. So they do a great job of getting the water quantity data, and we do water quality. This is a large watershed, a little over 4 million acres. Much of the watershed is in cultivated crops. So this is showing land use, and you can see a lot of brown on here. Those are cultivated crops. Your normal row crops, corn, wheat, or corn, soybean, a little bit of wheat, some specialty crops, some other small greens. You can see here the red areas that are, our more urban residential areas. And you can see there's more, got a little bit more pasture on one side. You can see a little patch of forest around Oak Openings near Toledo. You can keep, next slide. But the thing that's interesting about this watershed is a lot of the soils, if we look at them in terms of hydrologic classes, are very slowly infiltrating, right? So when it rains, water doesn't go out of these soils very quickly. It was a Great Black Swamp. And so a lot of these areas have to be drained. Subsurface tile drainage and ditching is common, mostly for, we think about it for agronomic purposes, but honestly, I don't know how many people would want to actually live in a swamp. And so it's, for our comfort as well. You can see there's a blank area up there where it's forested because it's not agricultural, so it's not included on here. Next. So what is our monitoring program? How are we monitoring the Maumee River and other sites? We actually have 23 different locations where we're monitoring. The Maumee River is just one of them. And at any place where we're collecting a water sample, it's reflecting anything upstream that's going on in that watershed. If you went to one of our locations, you usually find a building beside the river. You have to click a lot on these ones. And inside that building, there is a refrigerated automatic sampler. And that's collecting samples 3 times a day. We analyze all 3 samples if the flow is high or the water is turbid, like you see up there. Otherwise, we do a minimum of 1 sample a day. And we started monitoring the Maumee River in 1975, meaning that we have an almost continuous database of water quality. It's only missing data if something breaks. We go and retrieve samples every week and we bring them back to the laboratory. You can go next. And where we process them, we either digest total samples or we filter out the particulates and we analyze the dissolved samples. Next. And then we analyze them for various things, different forms of nitrogen, different forms of phosphorus. For phosphorus, we're using colorimetry. So the darker the blue, the more phosphorus there is. And next. And then we get a lot of data, and that's what I'm going to show you today. Now, I processed a lot of data, right? It doesn't come out like this, but you can see it looks like that. Okay, go ahead. So before I show you any data, I want to make sure we all speak in the same language. So a lot of times we talk about phosphorus, we have these various forms. We have total phosphorus, which has all of the particulates and all of the dissolved stuff all in one. And that's really the sum of dissolved phosphorus, what makes it through the filter, as well as particulate phosphorus, what gets trapped on the filter. Really, we don't analyze particulate phosphorus, we get that by difference. And what I'm going to show you today is total bioavailable phosphorus, because we have found over time that that does a really good job with the bloom forecast. And basically, you can read the language, I'll just say it to you as well. Total bioavailable phosphorus is essentially the amount of phosphorus that's chemically available for algae to use and makes it from Waterville all the way to the lake. Turns out a lot of particulates settle out before it gets to the lake. So that ends up being all of the dissolved reactive phosphorus, makes it out to the lake, and then about 8% of the total particulate, right? So that's literally what the calculation is. So I'm going to show you a little bit of each of these different parameters as we move forward. And so what I'm going to show you, I'm giving away my whole talk in one slide, so I could leave after this, but basically it's been dry. WTOL told us that it was the driest May since 1934, which was the Dust Bowl era. We know we have some ag folks here, so you know that that means something more than probably the rest of us. And then this other figure is showing the drought deficit, how much less rain we've gotten in May, and that's down to like -2 to 3. So we've had 2 to 3 fewer inches of rain in May, cumulative, than we were expecting, normally would have. So it's been dry. Go ahead, one more. There you go, perfect. And so with that, if we first just look at flow, this is stream flow discharge. It's 1 million gallons per day. You can see it rained in March and then not really again. So there's a little something here, but this is so tiny. Like these aren't even that big compared to a normal year. So we got all of our rain really in March. And then when we look at our total bioavailable phosphorus concentrations, you can see they do exactly what you expect. When we have ag runoff, we usually see concentrations increase during storm events, so they did that. And then they even increased here with these little bit of storm events because, we've got some rain when we hadn't had any, and they kind of increased to a fairly similar level, especially for these first couple of storms here. But when we go and turn this into a load where you take the concentration for a given day and you multiply it by the flow for that day, we really didn't have any loading after April 1st. It was a little bit. You can see we got up to a little over 20 metric tons per day in that early storm, a little bit less here, but we've had no real loading since then. And so then when we add them together and look at how they've accumulated from March through the end of June here, you can see the big stair step, in these couple of spots here, but it's been a flat line. In fact, 83% of our load came in March. So of what we've had so far this spring. So, when we see these couple of days here, remember, you could probably add these up. We always like to talk about how many days brought the most loading. It's probably the most extreme we've seen this year because of how little loading we've got since here. I would say maybe 6 to 10 days brought all of our load this year. Okay. So this ends June 25th, because I did this about, 3 days ago. So we also use, you can go ahead, the National Weather Service Ohio River forecast data to project to the end of July. So that's taking the weather forecast, turning it into a flow at the Maumee River, and then we project from there. And you can see that they're not projecting that with whatever rainfall we're getting, that it's going to generate a whole lot of flow. It is very dry. It's going to take a lot of rain to get a lot of flow right now. So what we're at 218 metric tons currently of total bioavailable phosphorus. By the time we get to the end of the season, we're expecting to gain another maybe up to 15 more metric tons at most. And if you compare this to the other years, you can see we're kind of on the low end of things, not as low as our very minimum, which would be mostly 2012 when we get to the end there, but nowhere near our maximum and a little bit lower than what we've seen in 2020 and 2022. Okay, let's move on. So how does this compare to past loads? What have we been seeing over time? So this shows us our stream flow discharge again, so just water from 1975 up to today. This is a 5-year running average, and you can see flow oscillates. Our most current oscillation went a little higher than our past ones, but it seems like we're on the downward slope with that oscillation right now. And this year is following suit. We're lower so far this year than what we've had for the past 3 years. Which if you've seen me give this talk for the past 3 years, I've said we were lower than we have been on average. So we are continuing with that trend. We are pretty low levels of stream flow so far. For total particulate phosphorus, you can see the loading kind of tracks what we see with discharge, except that early period of record, we got a lot more particulate phosphorus runoff because we didn't have any conservation practices in place in the same manner that we do now. Our loads are a little higher than the past couple of years. So that's interesting. I'll talk about that more later. And we're a little bit above the target. So we're closer to average for total particulate phosphorus load. And then for dissolved reactive phosphorus, you can see it was high, it jumped down below our target loads and slowly increased. It is following that same sort of downward trajectory. It looks almost exactly the same as what we see for flow here, right? We are expecting this year, our loads are currently below the target. That target is if we're going to have a bloom like 2012 or not, and it's lower than the past few years. I promised you it's been dry. So go ahead. And so because it's been so dry, what we really need to do is look at concentration, which is taking that load and you correct for stream flow. You literally divide it by the stream flow volumes. And that gives you a ratio that's like helps you be able to see this without as much variation associated with how much rain we got. And these are our long-term records. And so I'm going to only hover here for a minute because I want to remind you all that total particulate phosphorus showed this decrease here. And it's basically flattened off. This decrease is associated with conservation effects. We put in a bunch of conservation no-till and buffer strips and CRP. It worked. You can see the U-shaped curve for dissolved reactive phosphorus and the big increases we saw from the 90s to the early 2000s. And we've since flattened off at the level we don't want to be at. And above that target. But if we zoom in, this is from 2002 to 2022, you can see a little bit closer what we're dealing with this year. Total particulate phosphorus, as I said, the concentrations are a little higher than normal, which is interesting. I think the reason being is that most of our rain came in March. And in March, there's nothing on the ground yet. There's no planting and come out of a winter, things are weird. So I think that's part of the reason. But the load being higher is a little questionable too. So I'm going to be talking to some of my agricultural friends to see if there's anything else happening this year that I need to be aware of to understand why we're seeing what we're seeing. For dissolved reactive phosphorus, you can see we're a little bit lower than our average. Our average is 0.08, we're at 0.065, but above our target and kind of similar to what we see with other drought years, honestly. Finally, finally, I'm going to end with my last slide here. And this is talking about, are the loads where we would think they should be based off of how much flow we have? So to do this, I developed these relationships. This is between 2002 and 2018. Okay, so we've got stream flow discharge here, and as flow increases, you can see this is for particulate phosphorus, loads increase. And they follow this best fit line really well, these tiny little dots here. I'm going to pop another dot, so I made them really tiny. These are prediction intervals, which is basically saying if a new point came in and it's going to be within the same variation of the past years, it's going to be between these two lines. You have to be outside this line for it to be different. These are our target loads. So we have particulate phosphorus, DRP, total bioavailable phosphorus. And what have we seen this year? Well, total particulate phosphorus is higher than expected. I think I've said that 15 times already. So it's higher than expected given how much flow we have. I think it's because all of it came in March. But DRP and total bioavailable phosphorus, the red ones, right on the line, meaning that given how low of flow we have low loads. They're below the target, but they're similar to past years in terms of what we would expect to see. So I would say that those two, yeah, the loads we're getting and the concentrations we have are about where we would expect compared to 2002 to 2018. Okay. You can see the other past years on here. I want to just quick point them out. 2019, we always talk about how it was lower than expected. So you can see it's outside the prediction interval here. You can see that 2020 for particulate phosphorus was higher than expected. We came out of that fallow year in 2019 when we had no planting and had the lower DRP. Well, then we had a lot of weeds and a lot of stuff to work our ground with. So we had higher particulate phosphorus. And so it's curious, this is probably a different reason than this being higher than expected, which is why we should dig into this year a little bit more. So here's the conclusions, the summary. Flow has been low. Hasn't been really this low since 2016 or 2012, or kind of lower than 2016, but a little higher than 2012. All of our load happened in March. If you summed up April, May, and June, those 3 months summed together haven't been this low in terms of loading since that drought year in 2012. Now, the bioavailable phosphorus and DRP loads are going to be near the target this year. Total particulate phosphorus is already over the target. So we know that that's probably because of that March precipitation. The concentrations of all of them are above our target levels. So that's meaningful. And then the DRP and total bioavailable phosphorus loads are pretty much where we'd expect given how low our flow has been for this year. But total particulate phosphorus is higher. And so with that, I just want to very quickly acknowledge that we have been doing this for a very long time, and we have some really awesome technicians that run all of these samples in real time as fast as possible and do a great job. And so I have the pictures from past and present of our techs and all of our lab staff. And if you need to be in touch with me or find our data, this is all available here.
Thank you, Laura. We'll hold off on questions. We're going to get Rick up to give the forecast based on the loading data from Heidelberg. So Dr. Rick Stump, also with NCOS, he's an oceanographer with the program. Rick's main role, as you can see, is developing forecasts, getting them from the research stage to the operation stage. But when I get to talk with Rick and we get to hang out quite a bit, he loves satellites and anything he can do to get satellite information to inform management decisions is a good thing. Rick, coming to you.
Thank you so much, Chris. Really thank Ohio Sea Grant for supporting this. Again, it's 12 years, as our Dr. Kapnick had said, and this is the major effort to try to support the whole community in this area, the state of Ohio, state of Michigan, and also Ontario, again, the other side of the lake has the same issues. The modeling part here, when we get this up, we do an ensemble and we work with some models also, University of Michigan, NC State University, and Stanford University, Carnegie Institute of Science, all provide models to complement the models we develop. So we work on this as an ensemble approach for it. Excellent. So I can't emphasize enough, though, the Heidelberg, Laura Johnson, and Dr. Dave Baker, the late Dave Baker, who started that whole lab. This is our ability to do this totally depends on having accurate and great nutrient data. And this is the best nutrient monitoring program in the country, I have to say. So you all the support you can give to them, you should do so. So we work closely, and I say the Ohio River Forecast Center is not the Ohio, it's the Ohio River Forecast Center. Forecast rivers, not the Ohio River, just so we're clear about that. They're down in Wilmington, and it's a great resource in the state for information. Anyway, go on to yeah, next one. Keep you in suspense for longer. Okay, so we've been with satellite data, we've been able to look at the lake back to 2002 and capture the blooms through different years. I'll just note that they do vary, even the intense blooms like 2011, 2013, and 15. They look quite different. 2011 was actually all the way to Cleveland, but people know that. 2015 was larger in the lake, but some are very focused. 2017, those in Toledo recall in September, it's right in the Maumee River in downtown, and it went clear across the lake over to Leamington at that time. Incredibly dense, about 300 square miles of scum in that year. So they do vary a lot. This is all due to the wind patterns as well as the size of the bloom, shaping where the blooms go. And for those who are interested, this graphic is available. We can send that out to people. So we use, right now we're using information. It's a European satellite. We've used the NASA one also. So, but we have a range of data component. Just to recap, last year, it was a moderate bloom, that 11th year of the forecast. And our forecast was a bit of an underestimate. This case, we forecast 4.5 into 6.8. It was smaller, while smaller in area than the 2021 bloom. It was far more intense. A lot of areas of scum tucked in the Maumee Bay and over and towards, particularly over up towards Monroe, Michigan, on that coast. So extremely intense in that area. So question, we underestimated that. We do these reviews and look into why that's the case. And the key issue we're finding is the lows in July appear to matter more. What we have here are years. We're showing the lows from each month. The one at the top, the darkest blue, is July. And the arrows show the ones where we have high July lows. And in each of those years, the blooms were higher than we would have otherwise expected them to be. What we're seeing is not too surprising ecologically. The blooms are developing in July, and you get a pulse of nutrients in, and all of that is potentially available to them, perhaps more so than the spring blooms, the spring lows. So we're getting more of that, perhaps driving that bloom. So we do have to pay more attention to these July lows coming into this. So we think that's one of the key factors. Another shift here is our severity index is not just the max quantity, it's a duration. So we look at the peak 30 days. And what we're finding is that we're getting a change in the nature of this. If we go back to 2010, the blooms were far more peak, you might say. These are 10-day periods of the maximum. And so in 2010, we had a 10-day peak. It went up to about almost 8, and then came back down. Whereas we look at 2022, slightly milder, slightly below, the peak went on for 20 to 30 days. So on our severity metric, we're actually getting off a little because a lot of that development was done on the 2003 through 2011 blooms. And these blooms since then are starting to show this longer duration peak. So we're going to have to address that. So the peak biomass is the same, but the duration affects it. Where severity matters, it doesn't matter. You know, if you get a peak for one day and it goes away, well, that's not too bad. But if it lasts longer, that's a variant. And so we're now trying to adjust the severity index to correct for this shift from the previous decade to this decade over time. Next. We're going to make it to the next slide. So let's see if I can riff on this one a little more. You almost there? Okay. All right. So shifting from the past, going to the present now, what we're looking at. So I mentioned about July. So what are we looking here? Our best forecast overall is that we're expecting the discharge not to be particularly large. Example there. I would note that the rainfall forecast now is potentially a bit above average. And so one part of this is if it rains some, don't be too concerned because it's so dry. A lot of that has to soak into the ground. So there's a lot of catch up work. If we end up getting some hits on more intense storms, then there might be a larger factor of uncertainty. Overall temperatures, just for note, a better chance of slightly above average on the temperature. But we are looking at a more normal rainfall in July. It's coming up. But that may not translate into a large. So we are watching July. This is the same one that Laura had, and just note that March was really wet. I think 83% of the load came in March, and that does influence this. Fortunately, that did not continue through the spring. Fortunately for the lake, it did. For the farm community, that's incredibly dry. I'm sure it's been quite difficult for all. I think we're good there. So just staying here. Questions come up about changes over time. Dr. Kapnick mentioned about climate. And if we look at the discharge from the Maumee River during the spring, when we have the loads March to July, we've had a period of wet years. There's probably a wet cycle. That's not unusual. And the more recent one you notice was the wetter times were wetter. There's higher load and the higher discharge in 2018, 2019 than the previous ones. But also, it's possible we may be in a dry cycle. The last 4 years have been about average. And so what we're seeing is the dryers appear to be getting wetter also. So the overall trend is towards more precipitation in the spring. And we are looking towards a tendency towards wetter wets and perhaps wetter dries as well coming through here. So that's something we at least need to be thinking about going into the future. We may see fewer of these very dry, very low flow conditions going forward. So the ensemble forecast I'll mention, we have a load through 218 metric tons as of now for load, and that's somewhere between 2016 and 2022. Whoops, can you get back there? And anyone who wants to talk about, Bayesian and mechanistic modeling and all that, I'll be happy to cover that later, but I'm not going to explain any of that here. But that's the different modeling approaches coming out of the different groups. So that's the load input, and they use various combinations of those. Next slide. Okay, so forecast for this year. Our ensemble, we're predicting a smaller than average bloom. If we have a 1 number, it's a 3 for the severity, which puts us pretty close to what we saw in 2012, 16, 2020. Potential range could be from between 2 and 4.5. And the one part of this is going to be what really happens in July. If we get some very intense rainfalls, that may bump it up to the 4.5 level. If we stay on the dry side, we're probably looking at this 3, potentially even smaller than that going forward. So just to get a sense of that, the small is good. A bad side of that is even on one of these, there can be periods of small, intense blooms. So 2020 was pretty small, but there were some intense areas down in the Maumee Bay area. Sorry to say for the people who live in that area, Maumee Bay always gets a bloom when there is one. That's unavoidable. It's a question of how long. Formations of scum, I will add, depend on how windy it is. If it's calm, they're more likely to occur. If you have some wind at all, it's less likely. Just for context, was 2022. And those yellows are pretty intense levels in there. So that was spread over a large area and even coming out closer to here. Sandusky Bay has a bloom of some sort. It's very different species typically. And so different characteristics, and it does occur, but that's not part of the forecast. So next. And just to note, the big efforts in phosphorus reduction and what would be the potential impact. So what we see here is the beige top is blooms we've actually observed, and the green is what it would be if 40% phosphorus reduction were implemented. And I would note that, say, a bad year like 2011 would come out more like less than last year if we had that reduction, which people would be very happy, I think, to see that kind of difference. And something like 2014 would have actually been pretty much down at a very small level. So that risk would have changed drastically if we managed to get down that 40%. And this year we'd be looking at a very mild level. So next. Okay, just a few notes. We do daily satellite imagery. This is one from last week. There's been several days of rain or clouds since then, and unfortunately, we cannot see through dense wildfire haze. Yesterday was not a usable image either. Presumably, whenever it's clear, though, we pick up the imagery as well, and this is available every day. In fact, when we process it, it's actually available around 4 or 4:30 in the afternoon of the same day of the image. So for anyone who wants that information. Next. And our bulletin site, there's a QR code if anyone wants to tap to that as well. And you can get a PDF summary of current conditions. This is updated every day as well. We add in the satellite imagery we refresh the satellite imagery, but we do model the bloom location. The blooms move around. I can't emphasize enough. When there is a bloom, it is not everywhere. It's not all the time. And it changes a lot with the winds and with the currents. And we model that with NOAA's Lake Erie Operation Forecast System with that. So be free to get there. And there's more information to other sources, including Ohio Department of Health and so forth for other information. Next slide. So to sum this up, our forecast severity, we expect a 3. And that's a smaller than average bloom, we expect. And it should stay there pretty much if we get the slow flow in July. The areas with high bloom concentration have the greatest risk of scum. And keep yourself, your kids, and your dogs out of the water if you see scum or if the water looks green. It is dangerous. In this country, several dogs every summer die from swimming in cyanobacteria. So that's really important to do that. We have the website up and we have current forecasts, including trying to evaluate the scum, trying to actually forecast scum presence as well. So thank you all very much.
Rick, thank you for that. So you haven't seen the official forecast, folks, online. Actually, Jill, if you can pass around, we actually have the press release from NOAA that we'll get that around everybody. So you have a hard copy floating around. We do have some questions coming in online. Laura, so if you want to work your way up, we'll hand the microphone back and forth between you, Rick, and I. So Laura, the question coming in for you first was, does March load include phosphorus from applications in the preceding fall, including manure application to clear space for winter?
Yeah. So the loading that we see based off of 2019 and a lot of the work that's been coming out of Will Osterholtz's efforts and Kevin King's group is showing that really of the phosphorus that runs off or of our phosphorus loading, probably somewhere between, I'd say 60 to 80% of that is coming off of phosphorus that was applied in previous years or previous seasons. So there's some amount that would be coming potentially from that fall. It's probably, a lower percent, 20, 30%. We maybe get up closer to 40 if we include that sort of as incidental runoff. But most of the phosphorus we see is that older phosphorus, that is stuff that's accumulated in the soil, which isn't a surprise because that's how we manage soil fertility, take advantage of sticky phosphorus.
Yeah, so Laura, I've got one more question. Please close that. So the question's coming in and I'm going to pull a slide up for you. It says, Laura indicated DRP levels in the 90s were low at or below the target levels. But then the question continues, just noticed Rick Stump's slide about discharge patterns. So we'll get that up right now. The one where the wet, dry periods were there. And so correlation there. So if we had these low numbers, that's the one I want, right? So when you showed the low in the 90s, you're also seeing that as one of Rick's dry periods. And so can you tie maybe those things together?
Yes, so certainly there was a dry period in the 90s that would have corresponded to lower loads. But because we also see lower concentrations, which corrects for those loads at that period of time, that implies that there were differences in agricultural practices that did lead to less phosphorus runoff. So we don't see lower phosphorus loads simply because flow was lower. We see it also because there was less concentration in that water that was running off as well. I think that's what the question is, right? Yeah. Is there anything you want to add to that? Yep, it's basically it's the both of those. We have done work where we took the relation, you can make a relationship, it's not the best, but you can make a relationship between concentration and flow, and you apply it during different time periods to see like, oh, is it just the water increases that have increased phosphorus? And some of our efforts in doing that, this is work with Helen Jarvie, who's now at Waterloo, basically showed that the increase in hydrology that happened in this more recent time period in the 2000s accounted for about 35% of the increased load. And so the remainder of that is associated with changes in concentrations.
The other question I got, and not too unexpected, is the wildfire smoke loading any significant P or N? I mean, I would say this is the first year that we've had this kind of scenario, and I would say TBD on that. But then a follow-up is another question from somebody in the media circle here. So is the timing of when the rain comes or the general low overall rainfall that seems to be affecting the P? So it's the timing or the low flow that affects the overall P that you're showing for this year's load.
For the total bioavailable phosphorus.
Correct.
Yeah, it's a little bit of both, so for the total bioavailable phosphorus, a small portion of it does include that particulate phosphorus. So the fact that our timing is a little bit sooner, that does affect it a little bit. But if you saw sort of where DRP versus total bioavailable phosphorus lied out, they're fairly similar. So really, the timing probably doesn't have as big of an effect. Dissolved phosphorus tends to run off at about the same levels for any significant storm.
Great, thanks for that. Got a couple other here before we switch it over to our next speakers. So, and anybody, we've got again some of our content experts here. So, do the speakers have any insights or people in the audience on why the 2020 bloom changed species late in the season? So they're saying the switch from microcystis to delictospermum. I don't know if Tom's still here or Justin. Any thoughts on the switch?
Tom, do you have something on that?
2022 switch from microcystis to delictospermum. Any thoughts on what the academic community and researchers are thinking about that transition? Everybody, Tom Bridgman from the University of Toledo.
Thanks. I don't know about the academic community, but what I think happened in the last fall was that we had an exceptionally sunny fall last year. We had more, and I looked at some data. We had brighter, sunnier days in the fall, and because delictospermum requires a lot of sunlight to fix nitrogen, I think that gave it an advantage. And the bloom transitioned from microcystis to delictospermum because of that bright, sunny fall weather we had.
I'll add into that nitrogen slowly it runs out through the bloom. So as the bloom goes on, like nitrogen is lost. We need both nitrogen and phosphorus. There's a lot of phosphorus when the bloom starts, and it drops off and drops off. So when we get into late fall, there's very little nitrogen, and delictospermum can actually fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, which goes into the water. So it made a position with that to do that. And Justin's going to say something. Justin Chaffin of Ohio State.
Oh yeah, Justin Chaffin from Ohio State University Stone Lab. The bloom normally switches to delictospermum every year. Some years it may not reach 100% of the biomass, but normally when it does switch to delictospermum, the overall biomass is going down. So every August, September, October, we see majority of delictospermum, but it's at such low biomass that it might not even register on satellites. This year, the switch happened somewhat early in the year, but it kind of hung out at high biomasses for a month or month and a half.
It also does better in cooler water temperatures than microcystis as well. And that goes with Tom's sunny and
the The dodospermum that happens in Lake Erie does not produce microsystems.
It does produce scum though. It's pretty ugly on the Michigan shore, unfortunately.
So the next question I have, what are the recommended mitigation techniques to limit loading, and are any incentivized or required by law? So I will take a crack at it, but there are also folks in the audience that can help with that one. I mean, there are many, and this is what I love about the H2 Ohio, is what we're deploying a lot of those. So under the governor's, again, H2 Ohio, so those funds are going to EPA to do a lot of water treatment improvement things, but DNR is deploying wetlands. Under ag, we're seeing a lot of efforts to do all of the things, soil testing, variable rate technology, subsurface placement, not just of commercial fertilizer, but of manure. We're working in the space of two-stage ditches, which we'll hear about a little bit later. So a lot of those things are being incentivized. Some of them are by law, not across the board, but we will see things that are in place about when applying on frozen ground or before a storm event. And if you're going to apply commercial versus manure, when and how far ahead of a storm event that can happen, those are all things that are out there. So it is a great combination of many tools in the toolbox, and many of those are being incentivized currently. And also there are some that are regulated. I mean, we're learning. Again, all the stuff we're doing now, the researchers you're seeing here, the research that's been funded under GLRI and under, again, the Ohio Department of Higher Education, is really modifying those things that we learn about subsurface placement, cover crops, what cover crop to put down, when to put them down. So all of these things are being modified. And that's why I love the fact that the question asks mitigation techniques or management practices. I never like to say best management practices because there is no one best. There are some that show some bigger bang for the buck in certain locations. We're seeing that subsurface placement of nutrients, and whether commercial or manure, is a good way to go. Jay Martin will come up and talk a little bit probably about his modeling work. Buffer strips are another one. So we do know that some of those tools in the toolbox are more ubiquitous and they need to be everywhere. And some, it really depends on farm. And so before I go to the next question, I'll say that's what makes this issue very complicated in the Western Lake Erie Basin. There is no silver bullet. And also what works on one field is not always going to work on another field. So we got to think of the millions and millions, 7.2, I think, or 7.3 million acres that are in the West or in the Maumee River. It's a tough problem. We're doing the right things to move in the right direction. Jill, I'm seeing those sets of questions. I think we're good for right now. What we're going to do is we're going to transition over to our next speakers. John Witter is next. Hopefully we work through these little glitches on the Zoom meeting. I'm going to bring up John Witter. So John Witter does come to us from OSU. So he's in the hort and crop science. A lot of the work that John does is in some of these, again, management practices. I wouldn't say, again, best management practices, but he spends a lot of time looking at drain water control structures, looking at two-stage ditches, which you'll hear about today. So a lot of that idea of managing the movement of that water and then those nutrients off the landscape. So let's hope, are they both showing the same screen this time, Jill? Okay, we're good to go. You just want to tell me next, we'll move forward. So John Witter, everybody, again, Ohio State University. John, talk.
Thank you, Chris. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here today. For some of you that are veterans of these HAB forecasts and various Lake Erie meetings, you know that a lot of effort's been spent on in-field and edge-of-field practices, and rightfully so. But we do have opportunities to manage water once it's left and it's in the drainage ditches. So there's a suite of practices. The two-stage ditch is one of those that can be applied. Drainage ditches are incredibly important infrastructure for agriculture, for reliable crop production, but also for urban and suburban folks that don't like to be flooded frequently. And they're constantly being managed. So we really have an opportunity to encourage adoption of some of these practices so that not only can the landowners get the drainage that they need, but perhaps society can reap some of the benefits from improved water quality if they're adopted. So a lot of Ohio, particularly Northwest Ohio, is this patchwork of wet landscapes, wet sedge meadows, tall grass prairie, forested wetlands, swamp areas. And for public health reasons, centuries ago, those were all drained. And then we found that there was very productive agricultural land, so we further improved it through the installation of tile drainage. So perforated tile buried beneath the soil surface, anywhere from 2.5 to 4 feet. And in extensive networks, systematic 15, 20-foot spacing nowadays to quickly drain that soil so that farmers can get in and plant and do all their field practices. And I'm sorry, I know this is, I got this, scanned this out of a book. It is and I like it because it's fairly dramatic, but this shows how important that drainage can be. In these two plots, they received the same tillage practices, they were planted the same day with the same hybrid, received the same fertility and crop care, and the only difference is the plots in the foreground were not drained, and the plots in the background were drained. So a little dramatic, but it shows you how important drainage can be. And all of these drainage systems have to have an outlet, so the tile will outlet into a human-made drainage ditch. And from a civil engineering perspective, this trapezoidal ditch that you see across the landscape is really a brilliant design. It's incredibly effective. It's easy to, it conveys water downstream quickly. It's easy to construct. But from an ecological engineering perspective, it's not an ideal solution. Nature would never create this type of channel. So often nature tries to fight against this, and if the ditch system has enough energy, you may get a bank failure or sediment depositing. It vegetates, it might redirect the flow into the bank and cause bank erosion, and the farmer doesn't like that because it makes their field irregular. They like to farm in straight lines typically. And the solution to that is to go in and reconstruct the bank. The next sort of problem that can be caused, or the next response to channelization is if it's a low energy sort of system, you'll get sedimentation building up in the bottom. And that is an issue for the farmer because as it builds up, it starts to block the tile outlet. It doesn't function as quite as effectively. So the solution to that is to go in and do a dipping, a dredging, my favorite, cleaning, to reestablish the outlet elevation to let that tile system function. And oftentimes that material is viewed as a spoil, a waste, and they, at low cost, just spoil it in the adjacent buffer strip or near the edge of the field. So an alternative to that is when you have a trapezoidal ditch, you can see that in orange there. Oftentimes there's small floodplains or aggradation that accumulates in the bottom, and rather than dipping out and restarting that process, the two-stage ditch essentially tries to excavate a floodplain, right? Natural streams have a channel and a floodplain system. So this is trying, if you need additional capacity, additional drainage, rather than dipping the little brown deposition out, can we simply widen it out? So that's the two-stage ditch design. Next, please. And then there's kind of a modification of that, which we call the self-forming channel design. And what we do is we simply widen out at the elevation of the channel bed, the trapezoidal channel bed. And the hopes is that through a series of ecological processes, sediment deposition, you can see here, go ahead, go to the next one. You'll get sediment deposition, water, there's nutrients in there, and that's a good recipe for vegetation to come in. Next. And in that sort of scenario, vegetation will be very vigorous. You'll have stream channel that forms, you have buffers or small floodplains on either side, but the benefit of this is those floodplains are really low. So the water floods out onto them very frequently, promoting more deposition. Next, please. The low areas can become wetland. You know, if you have the right conditions, they're low, wet, frequently. Wetland vegetation, as the aggradation builds, it'll often turn to herbaceous types of vegetation. Next, please. And what we do is we spend a lot of time looking at how the channel takes form, changes form, so how much material is accumulating, and then can we sample that material to see what's in it. I showed the example I just showed you was an example in an urban setting, Market Forest down in Columbus, and it was very wide because they were trying to deal with some flooding issues in that community. So they moved the channel, made it wide. This is what it might typically look in an agricultural setting. In the foreground, lower left here, you see that's the original trapezoidal ditch. And it was essentially widened out. Instead of just doing a dipping, a maintenance of it, they widened out 5 to 7 feet on each side, so newly constructed in the background. Next, please. And here's an aerial view on top. You can see the footprint of the original trapezoidal ditch in the upper right. And you can see it was widened out. You can see the difference where the conservation ditch, the self-forming channel was implemented. It is wider. It largely fits within the same buffer strip that was there. So we're not taking large tracts of land out of production. And this one had a small drainage area, a low slope, so it turned into more of a wetland system, which you can see here. And when we go out and we sample, those are the sort of soil samples we get, the organic matter, the silt sediment that's there. And I know my colleagues that deal with wetlands, they get excited when they see that sort of material. Okay. I know I gave you a lot of slides to go through. It's stuff. So as engineers, a lot of what we do is try to make these measurements and then develop tools to help people evaluate the trade-offs. Yes, it does take some additional land. There's some stability benefits to it. It's going to impact crop production, the frequency of flooding. There'll be these environmental benefits, we believe, in terms of water quality, habitat. Some ag landscapes, the only habitat is the ditch in those areas, and then construction and maintenance costs. So we help to evaluate all those trade-offs with some of the tools we build. Next, please. And like I said, these are just tools in the conservation toolbox. Our conservationists, they put a grass waterway where it belongs, a wetland where it belongs, controlled drainage where it belongs, and likewise, they can help work with landowners to evaluate whether one of these conservation ditch designs will help address their resource concerns, as well as resource concerns we have as a society. So they're just tools in the toolbox. I'm going to share a little bit of research with you here. We have some fairly long-term data sets at 9 sites, and we have 2 agricultural sites that we've been monitoring. They're fairly long-term data sets for 10 to 16 years. We've done some work on nitrogen and phosphorus mineralization, and those are shorter term. At 3 sites, we've got 1 to 2 years worth of data at those. The sites that I'm going to share with you, they're fairly small. They've been done with individual development projects over the years, so they're really short, 150 feet to just over a quarter mile of ditch, so fairly small, especially small relative to what's being implemented through some of the H2 Ohio program. Their watershed drainage areas are anywhere from 80 to about 1,600 acres. Like I said, the treatment areas, so the area that's in the footprint of the ditch relative to the watershed area draining to it is typically fairly small, so anywhere from 0.04% to 0.46%. So we're not taking huge tracts of agricultural land out of production. I want to show you some of the annual rates, how much we're going to focus on phosphorus here, but we've got nitrogen and carbon as well. Go ahead and do the first animation. So on average, these small reaches of ditch are trapping about a little more than 50 pounds of phosphorus per year. If you look over their lifetime, you know, they've been there for 10 to 16 years. On average, they've accumulated about 800 pounds of phosphorus. And if we look to project what they're going to fill up, we can predict how much longer they're going to accumulate that sediment. It looks like a little over 3,000 pounds on average. These projects that we've been working on in the 16 years now. If we want to do a little comparison, you know, how do we put this in context? How do these compare to some of the other things that we're funding, other ecosystems we know that are beneficial, you know, through research and literature? If you compare these to natural and forested wetlands, we look at the soil organic matter levels, total carbon, total nitrogen are similar or higher than what we see in the published literature for wetlands. In terms of phosphorus, if you look at some of the work of Bill Mitch, who was at Ohio State, you know, he's looking anywhere 3.5 to 4 grams per meter squared per year of phosphorus accumulation in these wetlands. And so far, our 9 sites have looked anywhere from about 3.2 to 24.9. And we think the reason for that is we've got a relatively small footprint, and we've got a fairly large drainage area coming into that, feeding it sediment, feeding it water. So I don't know that it's necessarily better or worse than wetlands. It's just the condition it's in. We have small sites that are treating a large area. We're also looking at that. Once you trap a bunch of sediment, phosphorus in the bottom of the ditch, you might ask the question, well, when does that become legacy and you start to release that back into the environment in a form that's not, that it's not the form you want? So we've done a little bit of work with these in situ resin cores. So there's these feeds that will, as phosphorus, nitrate, ammonia goes by, it'll grab those and retain them, and then we take them into the lab and we extract them. So there's basically three bags. We get a 5 centimeter soil core. There's 3 bags on the bottom, 3 bags on the top. The top bag will take all of the phosphorus, nitrate, ammonium out of the overlying water column as water goes into the soil core. The bottom one will take nitrogen, phosphorus from the groundwater that's entering the soil core. And then the 2 inner bags will tell us how much has been mineralized and potentially released from that floodplain soil that we've trapped in the bottom of the ditch. And the 2 center bags are check bags. Hopefully we don't get any nitrogen, phosphorus, ammonium in those, and that serves as our check bag to tell us whether or not we got a good measurement. And to make a long story short, what we're finding is that the amount of phosphorus that's been mineralized is anywhere from 0.3 to 1 grams per meter squared per year, depending upon how we look at it. So it looks like we're trapping 3 to 25 and potentially releasing 0.3 to 1. I think there are some opportunities where we might manage those to limit the release, but that's some ongoing research I'll share at a later time. The other thing is once you've trapped a bunch of this sediment at the bottom of a ditch, what might you do with it someday, right? If you leave it there, at some point it's going to become saturated. Is there a beneficial reuse of this material? So we dipped some of this out of ditches and applied it to agricultural fields. So instead of in the buffer or right next to the ditch, we've applied it to a field in a thin layer. And we've done 8 different treatments. The first 2 I really want to focus on are business as usual, the farmer. Our first 2 treatments were the farmer with and without fertilizer. We've done this with the ditch sediment that we've dredged with and without fertilizer. We also did it with dairy manure solids and then subsoil that you get when you construct the ditch. But we're going to focus more on the ditch soils here. At the end of the season, we harvested those with the plot combine. We did 2 years, a year of corn and a year of soybeans. And here's the results. I'm only going to focus on a couple of these, so go ahead. The first 2 are our control. That's the field as the farmer would normally farm it. And then the next 2 are our sediment amended plots. So they dredge sediment, we put it on the plots 2 inches thick. So, and remember, treatment 2 and treatment 4, all the even treatments receive nitrogen fertilizer based on the tri-state fertilizer recommendation. So where we had just the control, no fertilizer, our average corn yield the first year was about 187 bushels per acre. Where we added nitrogen chemical fertilizers, our average yield went up to 213, and those were significantly different. Where we added just sediment, no fertilizer, we had an average yield across 5 replications of 221. Those were not significantly different from chemical fertilizers. So the sediment, we had an average that was about 8 bushels more, but not significantly different if you look across the data set. And then where we added both, next one, please. And where we had added both sediment plus chemical fertilizers, we got an average of 242, and that was not different from the sediment. Second year, we did soybeans. I no-tilled soybeans straight into the plots, no additional fertilizer. And we had our sediment amended plots average 77 to 78 bushels per acre. And where we had the control field or the control field with chemical fertilizers the previous year, we averaged just below 70, and those were significantly different. So granted, this is one site for 2 years, that's it. So take it with a grain of salt. We need to replicate this in different conditions across the state, but it looks like this might be a beneficial material to manage, and it might help us get some of the phosphorus out of the ditches. It might compel a landowner to do that because there's something of value there. We've got some recommendations. We think it might take an addition, some resources to help convince people to construct a bigger ditch. Maybe we can work with some different types of vegetation or seeding methods to promote that deposition. We think there's some projects of moderate length implemented widely across the basin might be helpful or downstream of areas that have water quality issues. I also think we can target some direct tributaries to large rivers. Once that water gets into a large river, there's less opportunity for it to be processed. And then we think that there's some byproducts we might be able to amend to those soils in the bottom of the ditch that would help retain some of that phosphorus until it can be removed and has that less risk of moving downstream. There's my contact information if anybody would like to follow up afterwards. And I wanted to make sure I pointed out Ben Mecklenburg, who works with me. He was at ODNR for decades and decades. and started this work, and we've continued it on at Ohio State now that we work together.
All right, we're going to put up the next, John, thank you for that presentation. That's great. Do we have any quick, maybe one question for John as he's walking off? Anybody in the room? All right, not seeing or hearing any. You can shut this one down. Thanks. Moving on from that one. So next we're going to have Jay Martin come up. So Jay Martin is a professor at Ohio State University also. He's within the College of Food, Ag, and Environmental Sciences, which is where also Ohio Sea Grant and Stone Lab reside. Jay is a professor in Food, Agricultural, and Biological Engineering department. Taking me a while to get that title down too. So Jay and same thing with Dr. Witter have both been recipients of some of those research dollars that came through the Ohio Department of Higher Education Research Initiative. And again, I can't stress enough that those projects that are selected are addressing priorities that are provided by our state agencies. So as soon as we know that the Ohio Department of Higher Education HABs research grant is in the budget, my first call is to the Director of Ag and Director of EPA or their respective researchers, and the priorities that drive that RFP or that proposal process come from our agencies. So the project you heard from Dr. Witter and the one you're going to see here are informed by what the agencies would like to see. Waiting on it here. Yep. Sorry for those online, we're working on it right now. Bill, are you seeing it on both screens then, sir? Good, okay, so everybody, Jay Martin, and he's going to talk about phosphorus reductions from legacy phosphorus fields. So Jay, all yours, sir.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris, for having me on the program today. And good afternoon, everyone. Some of you probably heard me talk about legacy phosphorus fields before, but I'm going to start with a definition about what legacy phosphorus fields are. These are agricultural fields that have levels of phosphorus that are well beyond what's recommended for agronomic production, mostly due to historical applications of nutrients. And so with that, I'll move on. And there's quite a few slides here, so you want to click through them. The main point here is that why are we concerned about legacy phosphorus fields? And as a person in the academic community, I have the privilege maybe of reading a whole bunch of these journal articles. And anyway, the point is here, there's been a lot of consensus that we want to reduce phosphorus coming into Lake Erie or other places. We need to focus on legacy phosphorus fields. And so you can keep clicking. There's several more of these article titles. Some of these come from Lake Erie. Some of these you'll see come from other parts in the world. I think there's maybe a few more even. Anyway, there's a good level of interest and consensus that we need to be focused on these. So focusing here in Lake Erie, there's a few things we know about this. We know that the Maumee watershed contributes 50% of the phosphorus load that comes into Lake Erie. And that's really what drives the severity of these harmful algal blooms. And we also know, as Laura showed earlier, that about 80% of that comes from agricultural land use. So if we want to focus on reducing phosphorus coming into Lake Erie, we want to focus on the Maumee watershed and we want to focus on agricultural land use. Within Maumee watershed, we know that there's a number of fields that we call legacy phosphorus fields. Sometimes now we're referring to this as old phosphorus as well. So it's the old phosphorus or legacy phosphorus. Based on soil test results from across the Maumee watershed, we know that approximately 5% of the soils within this watershed have 100 parts per million soil test phosphorus levels in them. And what that translates to is that these phosphorus levels are 2.5 times the recommended level, which is 40 parts per million phosphorus. So they're 2.5 times above what we need to produce corn or soybeans or wheat from these fields. And so looking at a county level, some of the counties have higher, there may be 10 to 15% of the soil tests, some of them around 5%. But looking across this watershed, we know that these soils exist out there. So now if you want to click, that'd be great. So we know they exist out there. Why are we so concerned about these soils? Why did you see all those articles from the scientific community that say we need to focus on these areas and manage them? First of all, is that if we do have these higher levels, so here's 300, 250 parts per million, so well over that 40 parts per million. As we're continuing to farm these fields, we do see drawdown of those phosphorus levels, but it takes decades to bring them down. So while we're farming them, which we should be doing, we should be using that phosphorus to productive uses. It's going to take decades to bring that down. Secondly, while we're bringing that down over these decades, we're going to have greater phosphorus discharge from these fields. So as that soil test phosphorus increases, our runoff of dissolved phosphorus increases too. So there's a very strong correlation. The higher amounts of soil we have, higher amounts of phosphorus we have in the soil, the higher amounts of discharge we see from those fields. And so that's why we're so concerned. Then lastly, this slide points out, this is some of our modeling work, but it points out that if we can target our management to fields that have higher amounts of phosphorus, we're going to get a bigger bang for the buck and have stronger reductions in phosphorus. Okay, so knowing that, we've known about legacy phosphorus fields for a long time. There have been some hurdles to manage those. One of those is how do we find these sites? So they're proprietary. The farmer might know about it, the ag retailer might know about it, but as a management community, we've been challenged to find these sites and to manage them. So what we've done at Ohio State is work with the agricultural community and formed a public-private partnership to work with agricultural retailers to find these fields. And so through this public-private partnership, we've linked with nutrient service providers or agricultural retailers. They have the soil test data, and then they can work with the farmers. They can approach different farmers and say, hey, there's a group from Ohio State wants to find out how these fields work. Can we effectively manage them? Some of the important things that we relay to those farmers is that we're going to protect their confidentiality, we're going to pay for everything, and we are going to stay out of their way as we manage these fields. Our strategy was to replicate the USDA ARS field monitoring program that Kevin King leads to determine what are the loads coming off these fields, what are some successful management practices that could be implemented here. Please. So the first thing I want to do is give a big shout out to our agricultural retailer partners. The study would not have worked without them. Nestor Ag, Farmers Elevator in Defiance, Ohio, and then Nutrient Ag Solutions. And you can see that we have a range of different types of ag retailers, from a family-run company to a national, even international company is what Nutrient Ag Solutions is. And also shout out to Ohio Agribusiness Association. They put us in touch with these ag retailers. And the Nature Conservancy has been a big part of this project from the very get-go to help us plan and visualize the project. So how many fields are we working on? We're working on 12 fields total. You can see we started with 433 legacy phosphorus fields, working with our ag retailers, and went down from that with interested farmers. We had to find fields that were hydrologically isolated, so we knew we were just getting runoff from that field, not a field next to it. So we had a narrowing process that brought us down to 12 fields. I'm going to present data today from 10 fields. We're still bringing on the final 2 sites. Please. And this is a rundown of what we're doing on those 10 or 12 fields. On 5 of them, we're simply monitoring what comes off those fields to test the hypothesis that from these legacy phosphorus fields, we think that we're going to get higher loads. So are we getting those higher loads? On 2 of the fields, we have implemented controlled drainage, where we use weirs or stops at the end of the drainage network to hold water back in that drainage network during different times of the year to see if that's an effective way to reduce the amount of phosphorus coming off these sites. And then we also have 2 sites where we have wetlands to see if that is an effective way to reduce the amount of phosphorus coming off legacy phosphorus fields. And then we have 2 sites where we have phosphorus filters installed, and that's the data or the results I'm going to show you today. We are right now actually constructing a site near Mount Hillier, Ohio, that's going to be a combined wetland and peat filter, and we're really excited to bring that site online here shortly. So the first question is, does the phosphorus runoff from these legacy phosphorus fields, is it a large amount of runoff like we thought it would be? And the answer is that the majority of our sites, yes, we do find that high runoff. So 6 of our 9 sites have total phosphorus or DRP loads above the watershed goal when we look at it with the annual lens. When we look at it with the March to July lens that Laura and Rick talked about earlier, then we get to 7 of 9 sites have DRP loads that exceed the goal for Lake Erie. So we are seeing majority of our sites having the higher loads of phosphorus like we thought they would. But it's important to note that while the majority of these legacy phosphorus sites have high P loads, not all these sites do. Okay, so if we want to be able to effectively target management to these sites, how can we better identify which of these high soil test sites are discharging more amounts of phosphorus? And so one way we can do that is looking at soil textural properties. So looking across our sites, we find that when we have greater silt, we have greater DRP runoff. Okay, so there's a lot of statistics here. I'm not going to go into that, but simply said, if we're going to target management to these sites, we want to find sites that have high soil test phosphorus and have higher silt content in the soil. The next thing I want to do is show results, show how we can manage the amounts of phosphorus coming off these sites. And in fact, we do see the amount of phosphorus coming off these sites. And one way we can do that is with phosphorus filters. And so this is actually what a phosphorus filter looks like. The way we've done it is with 2 concrete tanks at this one site. You can get a scale for how big these are. And individual installing this site here. So you can see 2 concrete tanks there. The other one's a little smaller. We have 1 concrete tank, and that's based on the field size and the amount of drainage coming into these structures to size them properly. The material that goes inside these phosphorus filters, here it's pea gravel with iron filings. And the other one, it's a manufactured product called Algal, which looks like sand. I do want to give a shout out to Chad Penn, VOC ARS. Chad is really the mastermind behind phosphorus filters, and he has developed a software that's freely available that we use to size and design these systems, and you or others could use this to design them as well. So please, how do these work? When we look at dissolved reactive phosphorus, these 2 phosphorus filters are working very well. One site we have a 58% reduction, and this is over 2 years of data. And then the other site, we have an 83% reduction, so even stronger. So these do work effectively to reduce the DRP coming off these sites. And the DRP is something that not many management practices are effective with, but phosphorus filters are very effective with DRP. So takeaways from this talk today. We do now know how to locate legacy phosphorus fields. And one way is to do this with public-private partnerships with ag retailers. About 2/3 of these legacy phosphorus fields do discharge high amounts of phosphorus like we thought they would. And we are figuring out ways to more accurately identify which legacy phosphorus fields are going to have high runoff. And one of those is with the soil textural properties, especially silt. So we want to target these fields. We want to find them with high soil test phosphorus and high silt. And then lastly, phosphorus filters can effectively reduce DRP coming off these sites. And so just want to emphasize, we talked about management practices. Phosphorus filters work, but they're not what you want to have at the edge of every farm field. They're just going to be effective and work well where you have high amounts of phosphorus coming off legacy phosphorus fields, but they do work in those types of situations. I'm going to wrap things up. I do want to thank, before I sign off here, there's been a lot of partners that have supported this project, so I'm going to give a thanks to them. And then my contact information is in the lower left-hand corner. Thank you.
Great. All right, so we have time for questions. So we have about, at my clock, we have about 25 minutes left with each other still. So I'm going to ask John to come back up. And if Rick Stump's still here and Laura, they may be out answering questions with reporters, but we're here to field any questions that you might have here. And Jill Gentis from our office is sending me questions via the chat function. So I'll start with those while we give John and Jay a second here to get up. One of them is the 40% reduction enough to meet the target loads? And I know that we've still got some of our research experts in the back. So they're asking about the 40% numbers. We keep saying 40% reduction will get us to that target line. Well, what I can tell you, and I know Sandra Kosick-Sills is here in the room too, is that every year we've seen a 40% reduction in the load. We have seen that target met. And so when we've had those dry years where that load is low, but you don't have a lot of rain driving those nutrients into the system, the bloom that we see on the lake, the satellite imagery that we get through NOAA and NCOS shows that those are bloomed where that's our target. So there isn't really a lot of discussion on right now of saying is the 40% target going to change. I have heard in some discussions, we are in a climate change world right now. So if we see more rain and wetter conditions, then we might have to think about where that number is at. But I would say, I'm looking back at Tom in the back of the room nodding his head, and I can bring the microphone back. Justin's giving me a thumbs up. So we are confident about the 40% number. That was one of the questions we got in. I'll pause as I look around if there's, oh, Tom's got a question. Perfect. Or a comment, more likely.
Just a couple caveats about the 40% reduction. As Rick would tell you, it matters when the rainfall and the flow comes. If weather patterns change, so we get more runoff in July, then we're going to need more than 40% reduction. Also, the lake is getting warmer, so the HAB season is lasting longer. So even if we are reducing by 40%, it may not look like a 40% reduction because the bloom is starting earlier and lasting longer. So those are two weather-related caveats.
Perfect. Thanks, Tom. And Rick's here around the corner because the next question that came in online is for Rick. And it's funny because Rick and I actually talked about this last night. So it's funny how we cannot turn our brains off, and in evenings we're talking about this. But the question is, may I ask how the arrival of El Nino will play out in the HABs forecast in Lake Erie this year and in the future?
No impact this year, and probably not much one for next year. Maybe a slight impact. El Nino is not the, it has some influence on weather in this area, but it's not a dominant factor. Key thing is with the El Nino just developed, it takes a while for the atmosphere to respond. And so to get any response up in the northern US, it takes months for that to happen. Biggest El Nino impact in the US is usually in the southern part, where Florida, southern Texas, where it rains. Since winter rain, it's more common. But here, there's other influences. Right now, for example, there's been whether people call a blocking high pressure system that has kept a steady flow from the north coming down. So the reason it's been so dry since April is Canadian air tends to be drier, and the usual flow is coming up, moisture from the Gulf of Mexico getting up here. So the same pattern that's caused it to be dry is also the one that's also now bringing the smoke down from Canada. There's been some disruption of that in the last week, and we expect that one to happen. But there are other things going on. My point on that is there's things besides El Nino that influence the weather in this area. So it'll have some factor, but it's more of a nudge on this rather than anything. And this year we wouldn't see it. It takes too long.
Thanks, Rick. I'm going to come to Sylvia Newell in the audience. We've got a question about how does nitrogen load influence toxicity of the bloom?
So our toxins are made up of a lot of carbon, 10 nitrogens per microsystem, and no phosphorus. So phosphorus, we know, is probably the biggest driver in terms of bloom size and biomass, how many actual algae cells can grow in the water. But whether or not those cells are toxic have a lot to do with how much nitrogen is around, and also the timing and kind of nitrogen. Justin Chaffin has done a lot of great work showing that ultimately all the forms of nitrogen will feed toxicity in the bloom. But most cells start turning on their toxin genes and becoming really toxic in about May, June, late June, and that pulse of when the cells are really starting to grow up and there's excess nitrogen around. Once you hit August, everything is limiting the bloom. All the nutrients are basically being fought over by all of the cells. And so carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, they're all hurting for those. And then it's a question of how fast it can get turned over. So it does matter the kind of nitrogen matters, the timing of it matters, but it's mostly spring nitrogen lows that are influencing toxicity of the bloom. I would say late actual spring, like the calendar spring, not like we tend to think about spring.
Thanks, Sylvia. Anything else, Tom or Justin in the back? Good with that? Okay, so I'm going to come in again. We do have a question about, please explain where we are in meeting the 40% reduction by 2025. And I would say in this scenario, if we were to go back in time, this is coming from me, is that we did not know enough about how phosphorus moves. And we for sure didn't know enough about phosphorus already in the field, that old phosphorus, we want to call it legacy phosphorus, to really know whether the science we were rolling out and the work we were rolling out could get there. And so having the data out there when you don't have the science to inform your management and the difficulties in getting those management practices out there, I think it was tough. I think we were kind of behind an 8 ball out of the gate. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be pushing as hard as we are right now. Doesn't mean we don't take our foot off the gas and maybe even find new partnerships and new funding lines, depending on where those are. Foundation support, we have that attendance here. So I think we're moving in the right direction. But yeah, that deadline, you know, for us in the academic community, it's never really been on the radar. It's been do good work and keep doing good work. What has come up in another question is also a change. Is there a change in the flow weighted mean concentration? And I don't know if Laura's still back in the room. As you're seeing here, statistically, what our data is showing is that there is a downward trend, but you would not say that there's a statistical difference right now. But I will again put tons of caveats around it. We're not recognizing that as we're investing these funds into the watershed, when you give funds to an agency, getting those money out the door overnight is not happening, right? Not for lack of effort, not for amazing trying, but it takes a while to figure out how to move that money out the door. I can also tell you that a lot of the things that are being moved out the door have a lag time in which they take effect. So if you're going to put a wetland out there, it is not doing what a wetland does day one. That also takes time. Okay. And I'll also say that again, we're working, and I'm seeing Sylvia's got her hand up, got some great comments to come back on the back end of this. And so that's one. And so I want to remind people of the lag effect that we have. The fact that we have new sources that we are learning about every day, and the fact that it's not easy to roll funding out from an agency or from a granting agency to actual efforts on the ground. So that's what I've got. And I'm going to turn it back over to Sylvia Newell, again, the Director for Missions.
I just also wanted to point out that I understand there are a variety of thoughts about this, but I think it's harder to change flow weighted mean concentration than it is to change the load, right? Because in any given storm event, the water is moving through the same soil, right? And so we can reduce the amount that gets there, yes, but in one really big event, it's going to be harder for our practices to work. And so those high concentrations, we might still see them, but over all of the events, that's where all of our management practices come in, and we can reduce the load, even if in a really bad storm, we still have a high flow weighted mean concentration. But across all the storms, we'll go down.
Thanks, Sylvia. We've got now questions that are coming in from the previous two talks. So I'm coming to Dr. Witter. Can you tell if the P being trapped is or would be dissolved or bioavailable? Great. Thanks, John. Jay, coming to you. What do you define as quote unquote historical? A month ago, a year ago, isn't the most important thing to just stop creating new legacy fields?
Yeah, the most important thing is to stop creating legacy fields, and H2 Ohio is doing a great job of that right now, voluntary nutrient management plans. So that's something that there's been a lot of focus on. When you monitor what comes off the field, you can't tell if it was applied 2 years ago or 2 decades ago. So we drew a line in the sand at 100 parts per million soil test phosphorus. That's something those fields have been built up over time. I talked to the farmers who are working with a variety of past practices, including manure application, biosolids, over application of synthetic fertilizer. So there's many ways to get to those high concentrations. So it's hard to separate between what was applied a year ago and a decade ago. So we're just looking at fields that have a high concentration. But if you're up above 100, that's phosphorus that's been applied well over many years. It's not just what's been applied over the last 2 years. You're probably looking back more than a decade.
100%. And I think when we talk about this, Jay, you and I get to do this a lot, and we talk about old phosphorus and doing things, management practices, wetlands, again, drainage, water control structure, these phosphorus absorption pits are things that haven't gotten a lot of attention now, but you and I would both argue that doesn't mean we haven't been addressing old phosphorus through the 4 Rs either, right? So this question and your answer leads into the fact that us doing nutrient management plans, doing variable technology is addressing old phosphorus because you're not putting new stuff out there. So the crop you're putting down in that year is drawing down on old phosphorus. So again, we haven't ignored old phosphorus. We just know that there's probably more tools in the toolbox that would help us address that. Jay, I'm coming to you on the, so the question here is, what is your hypothesis for this old phosphorus in silt soils in DRP? So what do you think is the science behind why you need high silt fields to lose phosphorus?
I don't have a good answer for that. We have added around some. The initial thought is that if you have a soil that has a lot of clay particles in it, it's holding on to the phosphorus very well, and the water is not moving through that as good as water would through a more sandy soil. If you have a more sandy soil, it's not holding on to the phosphorus as well, so you don't have as much phosphorus in it to start with. On the other hand, the water moves through it very well, so you could dissolve more. And what we think, and this is just conjecture right now, but the silt is kind of in the middle, where the silt can hold a good deal of phosphorus and have a good amount of water flow through it. So that might be why we have more phosphorus coming off of legacy fields with more silt. So it's kind of right in the middle between clay, where the water doesn't flow through it as much, sand, where it doesn't hold on to phosphorus as much. Silt's right in the middle, where it holds on to phosphorus kind of a medium level and has a medium level of water flowing through it. Just conjecture at this point. I have no idea if that's an answer or not.
Thanks, Jay, for that. And coming back to Rick, can you talk about the timing of this forecast? Why this forecast is held at the end of June rather than later in July?
Where the goal is to get, well, when we started this, we figured it only mattered through the end of June. And as a practical part, it provides a planning reference. So kind of addressing a management community need as well. So getting this to at this point, and if we have a dry July, it should be correct. We're going to do updates. We've recognized the need to, so we'll do an update in July. And I'll say, this is not unusual for NOAA. For those, you don't pay much attention to hurricanes up here, but NOAA does a forecast in June on hurricanes, how many hurricanes there'll be. It's updated on August 1st because there's new information coming in. And so we're actually following the model of our colleagues in the Weather Service by doing this to get the information out in a timely way when the bloom season is starting. And we have actually had a bloom start the last week in June. I don't recall which year, 2019 or 2018. So it's starting to grow, and they can show up in July. So we'd like to be ahead of that and anticipating.
Thanks, Rick. Yeah, question over here, Rick.
I was also going to add that with this, there's when you go earlier in the season, there's more uncertainty, and as that uncertainty declines, then we put another forecast out with more information. And part of that too is for all of our stakeholders that are using this information. They want information as actionable as soon as it's available, and so that's why we have an early forecast. But then also, because things have evolved and they still have operations through that entire time period, if you reduce that uncertainty, that information becomes valuable too later on. So we provide these updates, and these are operational now, and we will constantly be evolving and thinking as things change with this, but also as the needs change of all of our stakeholders.
Great, thanks for both those answers. So I have another one that came in, and Jay, maybe you can help me with this. I have some thoughts, and I know there's folks in the audience that may want to weigh in too. So what proportion of the legacy sites, the 5% that are over, that we're finding that are high, about that 100 parts? Is there any indication of why those fields got to that elevated site? So I guess the question is, was this because of manure application? Was this because they're low-lying spots and fields where even commercial fertilizer makes its way down there? So is there any indication that you're seeing about why those 5% are where they're at? Maybe what was causal?
Yeah, I would say looking at the smaller sample size we have, and we've looked beyond our 12 fields. I would say roughly 2/3 of the legacy fields we see are probably due to historical applications of manure. Maybe 1/3 after that's due to historical applications of biosolids over time. And then there's some that are due to their past vegetable production, like tomato production, where you need to have higher levels of phosphorus behind that. So maybe 2/3 manure, 1/3 biosolids, and then a few kind of scattering and other causes. And then I would also add, rarely do you see a whole field that has a concentration above 100 parts per million. Usually it's zones within a field. And lots of times when we look at a field, it's near where the old barn used to be. So they had a few dairy cows or something, and they would spread the manure close to that barn. So it's oftentimes not a whole field. It's a few zones within that field. And that is another management implication. So rarely do you need to catch the drainage coming off a whole field, but you want to try to catch drainage coming off those zones that have the higher soil test phosphorus. So that's another subtlety of how to manage these fields.
But in a subtlety, but also with the difficulty in approaching those, right? And that's what we talk about. If you have a 40-acre field, it may only be 5 acres of that 40-acre field. And if it's located in the middle at a place where that water runoff isn't going through your P filter, then we've got some concerns. And so the good part is that we know that legacy fields are out there. We know that we have farmers that want to show you where those fields are, and we have techniques to get to them. But picking those fields and the time and the money invested to get those fields with those instruments, it's not a trivial exercise. Clarifying question on the methodology for your project too. So in those fields you looked at, ones that were in your study, were nutrients still being applied while you were doing that, or did they cease nutrient application?
They've ceased nutrient application. So these fields have, as I've said, an abundant amount of phosphorus, and there's no reason to apply more phosphorus to them. So across the board, farmers do not apply phosphorus to those fields.
Thank you for that. Sandra, I'm going to turn the mic over to you just because I know you have a report, the Lake Erie Commission that has out that you wanted to recognize and that we can maybe put a link up for.
Sandra Kosek-Sills, Ohio Lake Erie Commission. Just want to make note that we have last year's water monitoring summary for 2022 has just been posted on the Lake Erie Commission website. That's at lakeerie.ohio.gov. And it has the summary of 2022's nutrient loads and flow weighted mean concentrations. This is the instrument that we've been using to track where we are as far as the targets. And again, with the largest signal that we've been seeing is from the flow. And we do have a chart on there that will show where the flow was. And it's a summary of the material that Laura presented this year for 2023 from last year. Thank you.
Thanks for mentioning flow, Sandra, because when I talked about like where are we in the flow weighted mean conversations, are we seeing a change over the last 10 years? I would say that for me, even if it's not statistically different lower, we are doing the things we're doing in a wetter time period. So at least we're holding ground in a wetter scenario than before. So I think that that's a positive for us to talk about and think about also. And we've got about 5 more minutes here. I'm looking around this room for questions. I'm not getting any more from online. I do want, as we have this pause, to open the mic for anybody that would like to have any parting words or comments or thoughts. And as I'm looking for hands again, I can't tell you in my 30 years of being in the space that I've been in, I have not seen a time where academic institutions are partnering as much as they are now. And I've never seen as much conversation, discussion, and partnership between those academic institutions and our state and federal agencies. So it's unfortunate that a drinking water crisis in 2014 put us in this situation, but the amount of collaboration and sharing, I was in the back of the room with Jennifer Day and Sylvia talking about a grant proposal. I mean, these are NOAA, Glero, Michigan Sea Grant, Ohio Sea Grant, and naming all the other partners we have on how we can write some grants together. And so as I'm still scanning to see if anybody has any comments or thoughts, again, this is not the situation we want in our backyard here, but I do think we have the right people in the right places and we're doing the right things. I do see Mary Culver here and Lonnie Gonzalez, who came also from NOAA and NCOS. So we have our acting deputy director and then one of our division chiefs in the HAB space. So thank you for this great, amazing NOAA presence today. Thanks for letting us use Rick's time all the time to get him out here to do forecasts for us. We love having him out here. And so with that, we're a little early, 3 minutes early, but they're rolling out food for us here in person. Sorry for everybody online. But thank you for joining us again. And again, thanks for all the great partnerships. Thanks for joining online. We'll get the recordings up. And I will be sure when we send out a survey online, we will get you a link to the report that Dr. Sandra Kosick-Sills from the Lake Erie Commission said so that you can access that 2022 report. So with that, we'll close down the webinar. Sorry for little glitches in the beginning with the audio and the PowerPoint, but thanks everybody for your attendance.